Okay, AMP1 students, in that last video I was cut short, wasn't paying attention to the timer. We were talking about the different colors that the melanin pigment could be. So that we'll talk about that in more detail later about how it influences skin color. That's another objective. So the melanocytes function, what we need to know about it is that it produces the melanin, which is a pigment, and it's producing it in response to the ultraviolet light or sunlight. So we'll talk a little bit more about the role of melanin in skin color and also in protecting our keratinocytes from the UV light that we're exposed to pretty frequently. Okay, so then the last part of our epidermal layer, called the stratum basale or basal, is the tactile cells. And sometimes we'll also call them sensory receptors because they're sensing, they're receiving information from the external environment, and then they're sending that information to the nervous system through the nerves of the body. So they're called tactile cells, and we'll go back to our picture and you can see they depicted one of them in here. So in our stratum basal, that's kind of the area where you can find these tactile cells, is also in the deepest part of our epidermis, so in the stratum basale or basal layer. So they're showing a little tactile cell there. And you can see that they'll communicate if they get compressed. Usually they're sensing touch, and so they will send a signal through chemical to the nerve, and then that nerve will take that signal to the spinal cord or to the brain so that you can integrate that information, understand what's going on, and have a response to that if you need to. So, all right, so that was our stratum basal and our cells associated with it. So the other epidermal layer that you need to be familiar with in more detail is the stratum corneum. So that's going to be the more superficial layer. So realize that there's things going on to their keratinocytes as they move from the stratum basal to the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum. But I won't ask questions about what's going on in those layers. So I'm going to slide past those, and then we'll go to the stratum corneum. And so in the stratum corneum, what happens is as our keratinocytes are moving from the stratum basal layer up through towards the skin surface, they start going through changes. And essentially what starts to happen to them is they will lose their nucleus. So we call them anucleate because they don't have a nucleus. A always usually means absence. So if you have an A in front of a word, it usually means the absence of that structure. So they lack a nucleus because they don't really need it. So their function up in the stratum corneum is protection, serving as a barrier. So they already produced all their keratin protein. So they're essentially little sacs, little cells that were just full of keratin protein. And so the nucleus just gets in the way. So they lose their nucleus. They lose some other organelles too. And what happens is they actually die because we don't consider them living anymore, even though they're still part of the body, because they don't have all those characteristics of life. They don't have a nucleus, they can't really respond, all that kind of stuff. They can't undergo mitosis or anything. So let's get our picture up here. So, and you can kind of, here's a living keratinocyte. So they're pretty much living when they're in these layers. But by the time they get to the stratum corneum, they are all dead cells. So they're considered dead, even though they're still, but they are tightly packed together, like you can see, and holding on to each other with little tight junctions. And they're forming this very formidable barrier. So it's very hard for anything to move from the surface of the skin, through the stratum corneum and try to get, into the body. So they are a very formidable barrier. But they are all actually dead. They're just little kind of sacs of keratin. So kind of with a plasma membrane around them and just a bunch of keratin protein inside. But that gives this area to be water resistant and also to be a formidable barrier to anything that wants to try to come into the body through the skin. So very little can pass through that. All right. So we have these tightly packed keratinocytes that are dead, don't have a nucleus, that are making up the stratum corneum. And there's quite a few layers, 20 to 30 layers that are in there. So eventually what's going to happen to them is they're going to slough off the external surface. So eventually once they continue to be pushed from the kind of the deep part of the stratum corneum towards the superficial part of the stratum corneum, they'll eventually be reach the very surface of the skin, and then they'll slough off. All right. And the other, let me go to our learning objective that we have here. Number 5 is know the length of time that a keratinocyte spends in the epidermis. So we talked about how the keratinocytes that are in the stratum basal layer, how they undergo mitosis. That's their primary job, is just to undergo mitosis and then form another, actually 2 daughter cells, where one of them becomes a keratinocyte that starts moving from the stratum basal cell through the stratum spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, up through the stratum corneum, and then be sloughed off. So we want you to be familiar with like how long a keratinocyte stays in the epidermis. And so they're there for about a month. It takes them about, 2 weeks to get to the stratum corneum, and then they spend about 2 weeks in the stratum corneum being a protective, part of the protective barrier of that stratum corneum. So their lifespan is about a month. So we'll notice as we go through the different body systems and talk about the different cells that make up those organs, and we'll talk about the lifespan of various cells. So these have a pretty, not the shortest lifespan, but pretty short lifespan, just a month, that the keratinocytes spend in our skin epidermis. So there's other cells that, like our neurons, that are part of our nervous system. They can live, as long as we live. So they could, be 95 years old. Our neurons can. So they have like a very long lifespan, as long as we usually live, generally. But then like red blood cells might just live, 3 to 4 months. So it just depends on the cell, how long their lifespan is going to be. So these guys stay in the skin about 1 month. All right, and so remember that the function of the stratum corneum was mainly protection. It's providing this very formidable barrier. Very few things can get through intact skin and get through that stratum corneum and make it into the body. And then there's also parts of the accessory structures of the skin, so some of our sweat that's released and our sebum that has ability to ward off or defend the body against microorganisms like bacteria that might want to try to invade and infect our skin and try to get into our body too. So it's a pretty nice defense against things that are in our environment, that stratum corneum. So very important to have. All right, so that is our video, kind of had 2 of them, over the layers of the epidermis and the cells associated with those layers and what their functions are. So the next video we'll talk about the variations in the epidermis, kind of get into some more information that's important to know for our integumentary system. So I'll see you in the next video.